We just met a woman just a little while ago with a real sad story. We actually met her husband first. He was looking for something to help with his failing eyesight, and we started talking about health issues and why eyes actually start to fail. And he brought up the fact that his wife was battling metastatic breast cancer, had been for, if I remember right, about 7 years. And we started talking about her. She'd had a history of gut problems her whole life, hormonal issues, cycle problems, and she started getting autoimmune disease of one kind and then another, and eventually down the road she had metastatic breast cancer. An interesting thing was they were pretty young. They were in their 40s. The wife came over, talked a while later, and as I started talking to her, I noticed that her tongue was white. And I asked her something about it. She goes, yeah, I brush it every day. And asked if any of her doctors had ever noticed that. Well, her whole life of working with doctors, and she said no. And I asked her if she knew what it was, and she said no. And we started talking about this topic right here, Candida Leaky Gut. All our healthcare providers had missed it. The key of what was causing all of her issues was right on the tip of her tongue. It was Candida, and that's what caused all the hormonal dysregulation, cycle changes, caused all the toxicity with autoimmune issues, and eventually it turned into cancer. It probably could have been avoided. So I'm going to open up this talk with that. And when we look at this, Hippocrates said that all disease starts in the gut. His science has proved that out to be really quite true. And this woman was a real good example of that case. And people that understand these things and deal with them properly, they can avoid those nightmares. So let's look at why people fall through the cracks first, and then we'll get into the subject. Malnutrition is a huge issue, not only in developing countries, but also in our own. We have two different kinds of malnutrition. You got calorie protein malnutrition, where people don't get enough calories, enough protein. Protein makes all your structures. And the other one is empty calorie overfeeding. That's a product of the food industry and big ag making foods that just don't have any nutrients in them, but they're addictive in quality, and people eat those all the time. It really destroys health. So both are very destructive. Another major issue is environmental toxicity, just the induction of herbicides and pesticides into our food supply. That alone is really huge, but pharmaceuticals are in our groundwater. They're in every municipal water supply. The birth control that women use within a city, it's always in the city's water supply. And those things get into the groundwater, it gets into lakes and streams, and it upsets everything. So we are our brother's keeper in that sense. We literally are consuming whatever our neighbors around us consume. And it really is wreaking havoc with the health of our nation, and nobody's really addressing the real problem. When we look at genetic issues, there's something called epigenetics, where our lifestyle, it actually determines how our genes express themselves. Every gene has 30,000 different potential ways to express itself, and how we live, how we think, how we eat, how we breathe, how we sleep, how we relate, all affect the genetic expression. Generally, it takes an environmental trigger to start the nightmare of whatever the genetic predisposition is, and a lifestyle can actually make that quite avoidable. I know one doctor who is he's the first in 3 generations of males that's lived past about 42 or 3, And when he was in his early 50s, he only had 3% plaquing. He knew what his genetics were. He adamantly followed a completely different lifestyle, and it looks like it's going to allow him to have, well, he's already lived over a decade longer than any of his ancestors, for 3 generations. And last time I saw him, he was pretty close to 60, so it's pretty close to 2 decades past. So we can really change things. Here's another thing that really isn't widely known. All doctors know this, but there's a cover article in Business Week called Medical Guesswork. It's based off of a study in New England Journal of Medicine that basically proves out that only 20 to 25% of the care that people get through doctors is effective. And granted, the article is for medical doctors. It's pretty much a standard throughout all healthcare. All doctors realize they're only going to really be able to help about 25% of the people they see. And they just accept that. I think that's unacceptable myself. We are way, way outside of that range. And that 20 to 25%, that's to slow a process down, to stop it, and to reverse it. And most are just slowing it. That's what the help is. A few stop it, and rarely do they reverse it. That's really the ultimate goal. We're over 95% of the people we work with can reverse their health condition, get them healthy again, regardless of what insanity they've gone through, how many doctors they've seen, how many failures. We're still over 95% of those people restored to health. So our approach and what we do is radically different than everybody else. And, some of the reality of why things are so ineffective is there's really not much study into what really works. We really have a radically different approach, and we test every individual for everything going on with them, and we test what they need to reverse that and make them healthy. So we don't use protocols. It's all individual thing. It's a lot more work, but it's a lot more effective. Here's another reason why, if we look at this article right here, this is from Journal American Medical Association. They haven't changed medical education for over 100 years, since 1910. When I was in college, we had a bunch of our instructors actually came from medical schools. They were frustrated. The administration of medical school told them that all they need to do is teach their students how to pass the boards. And the teacher said, no, we need to teach them what's really going on inside the body. They had an argument. They left the school, and they ended up where I ended up going. And the problem with the system is they don't teach people in any healthcare institution the progression of chronic disease and how to reverse it. It doesn't really matter what profession you're talking about in healthcare. All the doctors, they don't teach it. I don't know why they don't teach it. The educational system has really gone downhill a lot, and it's scary what they're graduating out there. Here's another sobering fact that isn't really widely known. The top 3 killers in the United States, first one's cardiovascular disease. That's typically been around 650, it's close to 700,000 in 2020. Cancer is the next one. It's generally about 50,000 a year less than cardiovascular disease. And last year it was pretty close to 650,000. Medical doctor errors is the 3rd largest cause of death. And the Journal of American Medical Association, they did an article where they really reduced the figures way too low. The researchers from British Medical Journal, they looked at those statistics and they said, no, you guys are wrong. you've really, really massaged the figures quite a bit, which we're going to see in a moment is a common practice. It's at least double that, and I've seen some studies where it says it's close to triple that. So it's knocking on the door of what cancer is, and crazy things that people die from with that. There's medical error, there's medicine errors, but there's over 100,000 people that just die of starvation in the hospital every year, over 100,000 that die every year from bed sores and things that are just really unexcusable. But people think it's a standard of care, and it's not. It's the third largest killer in the country. Here's another article that talks about the issue of padding numbers, like we just looked at in reputable journals. 40% of the best peer review articles in the best journals in the world have what's called spin on them. The results are not substantiated by the study that they did. They actually published a result that's different than what the study could prove out. And in America, that's expected to be closer to 75%. They've done studies onto what's the cause of the spin, whether it's error or what. 75% time it's overt fraud. And it's typically money that drives it. And it's really, really sad. But that's where people are going for care, is in a broken system that can't give them what they want. And that's why chronic illness has gone so crazy. Here's another thing that people really aren't aware of. Lab tests are nowhere near as accurate as people think they are. These are some of the results of some Lyme tests. We do a lot with Lyme disease. Western blot's supposed to be the standard for testing out there. Most people don't realize the testing for Lyme disease, almost all the tests, all the co-infections, it only has an accuracy in the first 1 to 2 weeks of infection. After that, it falls off the cliff. And at 1 to 2 weeks of infection, it's only 0 to 20% accurate. So falling off the cliff from there it really has no validity at all. The Western blot, it allows 6 to 8 weeks for testing, and then it's not valid either. And 69% of the children get false readings with that, and therefore they don't get any testing. They did a study. They got some people together. They did triple blood draws from all these people, collected 516 blood samples, carefully labeled them so they could track them, send them to the best Lyme labs in the world. Sometimes one lab would get all 3 samples, sometimes 3 different labs would get 1 sample. Of the 516 lab samples were sent out, no 2 results were the same. And this is the same ELISA standard that's used in allergy testing. It's used in the present health crisis going on. It really has no validity whatsoever. So people are looking for diagnostic issues, and they don't realize there's very little validity to them. And whenever somebody goes through the lab test, they're looking for a diagnosis. They really think that's going to help them. What happens is the doctors, they go through their system of trying to figure out what something is. They get a diagnosis. A diagnosis leads them to some protocol, somebody's idea. Their guess is how to address that. The medical doctor uses Merck Manual. It's a red book that you look up symptoms, lab tests. It'll tell you what's going on with all that and how you're supposed to treat it. The CDC and NIH, they direct the way medical doctors can address things. They can't go outside of that very much, otherwise they get in trouble. If you get in the other professions, you have doctors that tour all over the world promoting different ideas for different conditions, and they give protocols just the same. And those really don't work for people with chronic illness. And that's really why it's such a pandemic issue that's going on, this whole introduction of chronic illness. This statement right here is from one of the best Lyme labs in the world, Epigenetics. They used to have on their website the accuracy of their tests, 0 to 20%. They took that off years ago, and now they make the statement that their test results are not diagnostic. So I'm giving you guys substantiation from what I'm talking about with all these slides. And here's another article from the PubMed, and this is talking about the greatest challenges it is for clinicians to get an early diagnosis of different infections, co-infections, primarily from Lyme disease. This is rickettsia in particular, when treatment might be reasonably effective. The lab tests just aren't really that accurate at all. So when you look at the lab tests or typical evaluations, if you did the lab test to do one of our standard evaluations, you'd be doing over $9,000 worth of lab tests. And you wouldn't get as much information as we do. We do our own labs, and we do all of our own testing. Commonly we can do a whole set of care for somebody, with my cost being less than what other people's labs would be to find anything out. And we do way more care than anybody else. We get into pretty much everything. We dig deeper than others. We find more things than other doctors. We just found another supplement company had changed their formula without making any announcements. We started finding changes in people, traced it back to that supplement, and got a hold of the company. They won't even talk. It's because of raw material depletions out in the industry, and people are scrambling to do stuff, but rather than have integrity and pull it off the shelf or announce it and say, we're going to replace it with this until we can do something, they're just hiding it from everybody. That's a problem in all the industries. So we compare the approaches, traditional to functional. Traditional, it compartmentalizes, and that's when people, like the woman we were talking about earlier, get this strange new disease, one after the other, and she's got a long list of strange new diseases. And it's like they're all different and isolated. And that's just not the case. There's something that's common through all of them, and what was on her tongue really led to the key for all that. But since they weren't looking for a cause, they're just trying to deal with symptoms, they missed it. Instead of, in comparison from the traditional approach, if we look at the functional approach, you address the whole body, and you evaluate every function of all the organ systems, the entire body. We really break that down into the minuscule issues. We like the liver, for instance. The liver, it does a bunch of jobs. It's got an immune function. We test for that. It makes bile. We see how well that functions. It builds proteins, folds them, and puts a harmonic vibration that's unique to every different species. We test for that. It's got 2 phases of detoxification. Phase 1, which has 5 pathways. Phase 2, which has 6 pathways. We test all of that when we test the liver. We're not just seeing how well the liver works. So, as I said, our standard of care is just way above what others do, and that's why we get the results we do. Over 95% back to restored health, and the 5% that don't are people that don't follow instructions. So when we look at traditional approach, you're looking at lab tests, and when you look at the functional approach, you're trying to find out how well each organ is functioning in all the different areas that it's supposed to function in. In the traditional sense, you're looking at the bug orientation, the germ theory coming from the father of the germ theory, Louis Pasteur. But even Louis Pasteur, who spent his whole life studying bugs, he's the first one that came up with vaccines, and what he made was a lot different than what we have today, and it was pretty effective for rabies, things like that. But in his deathbed, he looked at his contemporaries' work, and he finally realized he'd wasted his life on the wrong thing. He said, Bernard is right. The germ is nothing, the soil is everything. And what it was basically stating is the constitution, the health of our body inside that determines whether we're going to get sick or not. The bugs can only take opportunity and thrive in a body that's too beat up where the immune system doesn't work. And it took Louis Pasteur his whole life to realize that. So with a functional approach, we're looking at the chronic progression of what's going on, trying to understand where to start, what's causing it, how's it affecting other things, and you bring it down into the root issue of what simple thing is causing everything, and you start to rebuild health from there. When you look at the traditional approach, they're looking at studies that are falsified, misrepresented, and all of that. And oftentimes their hands are tied because they don't have either the tools to figure things out, or they're told they have to respond in a different way. In a functional approach, we look at physiology, which is a function of all the different aspects inside of a body. In the traditional sense, the approach to care is protocols. Those are somebody else's guess that you hang on the patient that comes and hope they go away. Here, take this, come back in a month, 6 weeks, we'll see how you're doing. The functional approach, we do a lot more care than that. It's individual, it's custom tailored to every individual. We see people on a weekly basis when we start until they normalize, stabilize, their body functions are working well, and we get through some of the early stages of things, and then we can start stretching care out in a couple of weeks and farther. So our standard of care is just unbeatable. I've been rubbing shoulders with some of the best functional medicine docs for over 30 years. Fair amount of them know me. Some of them are personal friends. Some of them have tried to figure out what I'm doing, trying to steal my information. They ask others. They don't ask me because I explain why you can't just use a protocol. And they don't want to hear that. They want to steal a magic bullet. The magic bullet is lifestyle. And that's how we approach things. We do what's called individualized lifestyle medicine. We really walk with people through all the aspects of life to get their lifestyle in order to be healthy, and it's life-changing. Hippocrates made an interesting statement. Before you try and heal somebody, ask them if they're willing to give up what made them sick. And that's a real good question. To get healthy, it takes work on a doctor's side and on your side also. It's worth it. It's absolutely worth it. This is looking at Electromicrograph picture of the lining of the gut. The top picture is a normal gut. The bottom picture is one that's had chronic inflammation. And though the subject matter says this is celiac disease, it's anything that causes chronic inflammation in the gut causes this same progression. Food intolerances, inability to make stomach acid so you don't digest proteins. Anything in the gut causes this. Herbicides, pesticides, it's way beyond just what gluten is. So the top, those things that stick up, that's called microvilli. And you see a little cap over the top with black dots. That's the mucus that covers the gut lining in there, and inside the mucus is where all the flora, the microbiota, the microbes, there's the bacteria inside the flora, inside the gut there's more bacterial cells in that than there are human cells in the rest of the body. Volume of that's close to an ice cream pail, and its weight is about 5 to 8 pounds. That does a huge amount of digestion, does detoxification, makes hormones, neurotransmitters, it communicates with the brain, it does a lot of functions. But when the lining of the gut has those microvilli up like that, there's a lot of place for those microflora to hide and be protected. And the microflora, it goes up and it pulls nutrients out of the inside where all the food is, and brings them down into the membranes of the gut for absorption and nutrient transfer and different things like that. It does a lot of work in there. You see the mucus covering. There's no way for food to get there. So it's the flora that's bringing it back and forth. It's just a logical thing. When you look at the one on the bottom, all those microvilli are gone. There's no place for the mucus to stay, and all the good bacteria and all that get washed away. That allows a prime place for pathogenic things to grow. Candida is one of the more common pathogens that grows. This is what Candida looks like in its simplest yeast form. The cell walls of Candida in all four forms. There's actually four forms. There's yeast, fungus, fungal parasite, and mold. The cell walls in all those forms are chitin, and as we'll see in a moment, chitin is a real major problem for our immune system, because our immune system can't really deal with it. What's supposed to keep Candida in check is a normal flora. Anything you do to wipe out the normal flora, it allows the pathogenic things like Candida to overgrow. This is a severe Candida infection in a fungal form in somebody's colon. This person is extremely sick, not likely to live. When your health goes this far, it's really gone over the top. So whenever we see something like this, you know that the Candida has gotten systemic, and systemic Candida is one of the biggest issues in cancer patients. Candida can actually morph and turn into cancer. It can cause cancer, and the significant percentage of the cancer patients actually die from a Candida infection because their immune system is so depressed, not from the cancer itself. So that's a real big one. This is what a fungus really looks like. And I'll pull myself down so you can see the fungal bodies up in the upper right side. And all those cottony hairs coming off of there, those are mycelia. Those are the feeding tubules that pull nutrients out of the environment and bring it back to the feeding fungal body. They look harmless, but they're really not. Those are made up of chitin, and as you can see from this article, chitin is it's impervious to the immune system. The immune system really can't recognize it and deal with it. What's supposed to keep it in balance is the healthy flora that's there. But if we wipe it out, then it can't stay in check. And a lot of people realize antibiotics are a big player with that. It's one of the biggest. NSAIDs, your typical anti-inflammatory issues, those do it too. Chronic stress will do that. Food intolerance is one that's really not talked about. And when you get down to it, there's some things that kill the flora. Roundup, glyphosate in the food supply. That's a really big one. It kills the flora. But anything that creates chronic inflammatory issues, food intolerance would be in the top of that list. It wipes out the microvilli. There's no place for the flora to hide, and it just gets washed out into the toilet, and then you have this nightmare going on. So whenever you have that fungal form, it's like thousands of, or millions actually, of legs of beetles like this trying to push their way through the gut wall. And once they push their way through the gut wall, that fungus becomes a fungal parasite where it's feeding on the tissues inside. This is a depiction of what the gut wall looks like. And granted, it's backwards, but it does that so it can really easily graphically show. And the top of the arc is the inside of the gut, and the wall of the gut is what's down below. And what you see is inflammatory issues creating, on the far left, you see those cells that holding the lining of the gut together are really tightly held together. Those are actually called tight junctions. Zonulin is a major protein that holds those together. It's very much like Velcro, holds those things together. But inflammation starts to loosen that, opens that up where you have things start to leak through. The longer that goes on and the worse the inflammation, the bigger those holes get and the bigger things get through. You start to get undigested whole proteins and bacteria and pathogenic microbes, all kinds of inflammatory and toxic issues getting into the gut wall. Well, when that happens, it starts to hyperexcite the immune system, very much like making plaques in arteries does a similar type of a thing. And when the cells become too toxic from everything going on, the immune system starts to attack and destroy the cells that line the gut. It's an autoimmune process, which isn't really commonly talked about. The way the gut is designed, all the nutrients are supposed to absorb through the cells, and it becomes a selective filter. But with inflammation, that's destroyed, and it leaks like a colander, and anything can get inside your body. When that does, it starts to, I'm going to move myself around so you can see different parts of these slides. When it does, it starts to allow an abnormal amount of toxins to get into the bloodstream in the gut. And as we'll see in a moment, all of the gut blood supply, it directs back into the liver. And the liver is strategically placed there because it's got some really, really, really important jobs. The liver, it's supposed to catch and destroy all of our pathogens that leak through the gut. It's supposed to store all of our food sources. It stores fats, oils. It stores protein in there. It stores carbohydrates in a form called glycogen, which, by the way, we have flora, this microbiota that lines all of our mucous membranes. So it's inside the ears, the nose, the mouth, eyelids, through the whole gut. Reproductive tracts, and women's reproductive tract has a lot more than a man's does. In a woman's reproductive tract, it secretes mucus commonly, and the mucus is actually what hides and feeds in her reproductive tract the microbiota that's down in there. So the way it feeds it, it makes glycogen. The more glycogen it has, the more it feeds the bacteria in there. Lactobacillus is one of the more common ones that people know. As that starts to feed off of the glycogen, it creates lactic acid, which brings the pH of her reproductive tract into an acid form. And it's the acid, the microbiota, and the immune cells that actually protect her reproductive system from infection and all of the other things that can go on in there. When that glycogen starts to change, then and starts to deplete, or the mucus starts to get too thin, it changes all of that, and the healthy flora gets washed out, and the pathogenic stuff starts to grow. So it's always very similar to what's going on in the gut, and it really won't get that way usually unless the gut flora is really messed up too. So if a woman's having yeast infections, her gut's pretty messed up also. Some of the biggest issues that really make a woman's reproductive tract susceptible to that is birth control. The hormones and the chemicals that are used for that are really destructive. That changes all the cervical flow, and she's way more susceptible to the yeast infection. So that's that's right along the line with what's going on with the gut, because the flora is really similar to that. The liver also makes sugar from protein whenever we're stressed. The adrenals pump out a lot of cortisol. Cortisol dissolves muscles, releases amino acids. Amino acids go into the liver, and those get converted into sugar to help us defend our life. Liver is also supposed to help clear the body of toxins. It does it in 2 phases. Phase 1, there's 5 different pathways, and that makes free radicals and things more toxic. Phase 2, there's 6 paths of that makes things water soluble so they can be excreted. Pathological detoxification is when phase 1 works a lot better than phase 2. And that's where people really have problems. And detoxification is more complex than people think. There's not just a simple way to detox. You've got to find the source of toxins, what they are, stop the source, find out where they are. If they're outside of the closed loop of the gut to the liver, and they're supposed to cycle like that till they finally get processed and excreted. They get outside of that, they go systemic. You got to find where they are, find vehicles to bring them back into the liver so it can get back in the cycle and be excreted. It has to be a lot more creative than simple things, and there's no way that fasting actually does that. Gives a little bit of rest. Liver also makes bile, and it assembles proteins like I said earlier. It's older studies that actually talk about the assembling of proteins, and it's pretty amazing, but 80% of that happens inside the liver. So whenever the gut's leaking like this, people have a candida issue, something pathological going on inside the gut, the liver gets overwhelmed with all the toxins, and it's really struggling in a huge way. A common medical way to try and deal with all that is use antifungals, which really doesn't deal with fungal infections very well. It also inflames the gut wall and makes it leak and atrophy and destroys all the flora that's in there, and it also is toxic to the liver. So it's a really huge question that people have to wrestle with personally on, is it really worthwhile to try and address this fungal infection with something that doesn't work and can make my liver toxic? It's like drinking way too much alcohol. You can destroy your liver by doing toxic things like this. If you wonder about that, you ask any woman that has yeast infections, and she'll have those and has antifungals and calm down for a while, and they come back, and because they never deal with the issue. You've got to deal with what's causing everything. And whenever there's a candida infection, the gut wall's a mess and it's leaking like a sieve. You can't fix a gut wall without addressing the candida, and you can't address the candida without fixing the gut wall. It has to work all together. Microflora, the candida, the gut wall, you have to work on all of them at the same time. This is looking at an electromicrograph picture looking straight down on the flora, and this is one gut that's quite atrophied. You can tell that those microvilli are really reduced. You just have these little bumps on the surface, much like the picture we saw with the side view of those. And you can see that all these arrows are pointing to places in the gut wall where big holes have been blown in it. And you can tell that's going to leak. I mean, that's really obvious. There's no way that's going to work properly. When all that happens, it starts to let out something called LPS. These are parts of gram-negative bacterial cell walls that are inside of the gut. And those things are extremely toxic. They make super antigens, and those antigens actually start the autoimmune process. So autoimmunity, it's not a disease, it's a reaction. And the reaction is to toxins. Toxins are supposed to be processed in the liver, the gut wall, the flora, and the colon. And that'll change them through the 2 phases so they can be eliminated. When that doesn't work properly, then those toxins start to get stored inside the body, and they get stored mostly in fats. The fat starts to become too toxic, and when our cells get too toxic, the immune system attacks the foreign invader, and that's the process of autoimmune issues. Doesn't matter what kind of autoimmune problem that you have, the same thing's going on in the different tissues. So this is a common way that people look when they have toxic problems. And if you think about it, if you spend much time on the internet looking at the big promoters of keto diet, if you look closely, most of them have rashes on their faces of varying orders. You see pictures of their families. It's pretty common to see their spouses have rashes, they have hormonal dysfunction, and their children, they look like they have neurological issues going on because it's not a healthy diet. It doesn't give the brain the proper fats to develop or the proper nutrients, and it's really sad what's going on. But every time you see skin in this form, it's because of a toxic response going on. And food intolerance is a really big part of that. I think I said we do a lot with food intolerances. Not many do, but we check commercial foods. We test people for the foods in their house. We can test them in grocery stores and all that. And most people we work with is at a distance. Really no difference in the care we give, whether it's in-house or in distance, but most people we work with is long distance. The two ways the toxins try and get out, if they can't get out through the bowel and the bladder, is through the skin and the lungs. So every time you see somebody with something like this, they've either got emphysema or they've got asthma. Asthma is just a reaction to toxicity. A woman has one more detox route. Her uterus is another route of escape of toxins. Here's another article just to prove that what I'm saying is real. It's from the American Journal of Pathology, saying the autoimmune process could be arrested when you fix the gut, and you can't fix the gut without addressing the flora. So these are really, really closely tied. Now we get into the whole issue of hormone regulation. We'll start with the thyroid. Thyroid's probably the first thing that gets beat up. Thyroid and adrenal are it's one or the other. Usually is the first, the other one follows closely. And since the thyroid is simpler, we'll start there. The hypothalamus is a regulatory part of the brain. It's just above the brain stem, so it's just above where the neck comes into the head. It's right in the base of the skull. And it reads the circulating levels of gases and hormones, minerals, all the things like that, and it sends out signals to different parts of the brain to monitor and regulate those things. With the hormones, it's primary communication over the pituitary, which is just in front and a little bit below, communicates through a little vein. So the hypothalamus, in the case of a thyroid, it reads the amount of circulating active thyroid hormones, T3, 4, 2, and 1. Most of the studies are just on T4 and 3, but there's 2 more. And they don't even know what T1 does because everybody keys in on T3. And it's funny how science does that. Everybody wants to look at the same thing rather than really discover everything that's going on. There's more goes on with this. But the hypothalamus reads that. It communicates, say there's adequate activity of those active thyroid hormones, then it'll tell the thyroid, attaboy, you're doing a good job, keep it up. If they're too low, I say, hey, let's step it up a little bit. If it's too much, you go, we got to back off a little bit. So the pituitary communicates from the hypothalamus message down into the thyroid gland. The thyroid then produces a relative quantity to its communication with the pituitary of thyroxine, which is an inert hormone. Thyroxine then it goes and it gets converted into T4, 3, 2, and 1 in peripheral tissues. Most of that's in your muscles. The one thing about that conversion, it can go normal or reversed. Normal conversion is biologically active. The reversed conversion is not. Years ago, I was working with a lady who was in her 50s, obvious thyroid problems. She had just had wisps of hair that she pulled over the top of her skull, and mostly it was just bald, and you saw bare skin, but just wisps of hair coming over, and virtually no eyebrows. She was pudgy all over the place, fairly evenly. Her stature, she never grew right. They actually amputated one of her legs because her legs weren't growing right and put her on a prosthesis, so she grew up that way. She's in her 50s and she'd never had one menstrual cycle. Just textbook classic case of thyroid problems. Started working with her. She started losing weight. Then she met a medical doctor she fell in love with, and he'd say, oh, you don't have any thyroid issues from her thyroid test, and pull her off of it. She'd gain her weight back. She'd come back to me and get her back doing what she needed to, and she'd lose weight. And she went back and forth for about a year, and I kidded her and told her to have her medical doctor do a thyroid lab test that actually shows something. And finally, after a year, conceded to do a test that I had recommended. And when it came back, he looks at it and goes, yeah, that's normal. There's nothing wrong. You're fine. I looked at it. The reverse T3 was 198 times the normal, almost 200 times, just 2 points off of that. He thought it was normal, and everything that was in her body was biologically inert. It's no wonder why she was having problems. But whenever this happens, when you start to have too much reversed or this not regulating the hypothalamus, it starts to not be able to respond the way that it's supposed to. It's supposed to be able to read stuff, and it can't do that. Toxins are one of the biggest issues here, and almost everybody throws adaptogens at the hypothalamus thinking it's going to cure it, but it doesn't. We don't use them because it doesn't really do much. The real problem with the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid, all your hormone dysregulation has to do with toxicity. Hypothalamus is the most sensitive of all those tissues to toxicity. The thyroid is extremely sensitive too, and they're just reacting in a disjointed way, and that's where your hormonal dysregulation happens. So if we look at the thyroid, it's supposed to take care of your metabolic rate. It does that by controlling the mitochondria in your cells, which control how much energy they burn. With that, it controls your weights. 50% of a woman's menstrual cycle, 60% of miscarriages are attributed to thyroid problems. And it has a tremendous amount to do with fertility. Here's a research article to let you know that I know I'm not just making this up. These are two research articles also. The thyroid is overwhelmed with toxins, and the thyroid is what controls our energy through the mitochondria. We drop from that into the adrenal. The adrenals are stress glands, controls inflammation. With inflammation, it controls our immune response, controls blood sugar, posture, blood pressure. It makes the precursors to all the sexual hormones, controls the kidneys. Got a lot of work to do. And here's another article saying primary issue that dysregulates this is toxins. So if we look at a graphic picture of how the adrenal actually works, we got the hypothalamus at the top that reads the circulating adrenal hormones that communicates with the pituitary, and the pituitary sends out signals to the adrenal glands to regulate the production of, we're keying in on just three of the hormones that it makes. Pregnenolone, DHEA are the precursors to the sexual hormones. And that's what the gonads use in the peripheral tissues to convert into progesterone first, testosterone, progesterone converts to testosterone, testosterone converts to estrogen in both men and women. So that's how we make everything, and we, both men and women, make all of that. So people just key in on the cortisol issue because the cortisol is a real problem. But as we get older, that conversion happens more and more in the peripheral tissues. It's always going on the peripheral tissues, the gonads, the ovaries, and the testicles. They do the final touches of all that with all of their interaction. But once we get older, virtually all of those hormones are made in the peripheral tissues in women, half of them in men. Every indication that in men it's about half in the peripheral tissues always, which is part of the reason why anaerobic exercise, the slow repetition, loading things up so the blood can't circulate, really normalizes hormones. The same thing works for women too. We've done some testing on that. It's pretty amazing what it does. Not the real rapid high rep stuff, but the real slow that restricts the blood supply, and you can rebuild mitochondria, you can rebuild energy, and you can normalize hormones with that. So this is looking at something that goes on when we're chronically stressed, and there's all kinds of stresses. There's chemical stresses, physical stresses, electromagnetic stresses, emotional stresses, relational stresses. The body can't tell the difference one to the other, and it responds to all of them the same. It'll increase the production of cortisol, which is to control inflammation, raise the blood sugar so we can defend our lives. Whenever the cortisol starts to rise up because of chronic stresses, it steals all the pregnenolone and DHEA and shunts it over to make cortisol, so you don't have the hormone precursors for all the secondary sexual characteristics of men and women. So you start to see bodies changing. Men start to develop man boobs, women start to lose their waist. When it's bad, there's genital atrophy, there's erectile dysfunction, which erectile dysfunction and genital atrophy is a much bigger problem in women than men, but it's mostly ignored. And that's part of the reason why women with chronic illness have such difficulty with sexual interaction. First of all, their tissues are inflamed and they just plain flat hurt. Second, their hormones are off, which that aggravates everything. They don't make enough cervical mucus to be able to enjoy things, so you have to add something else, and those should be aloe-based, never an oil-based. Coconut oil is a hormone dysregulator. Just don't use that. That's why women have such a hard time in postmenopausal and chronic illness with orgasms, because they don't have the hormones to keep their clitoris erect and doesn't engage in sexual intimacy, and they have a really hard time doing that. So their partners really need to be aware of that, and there's more creative ways to get a woman to that point, and that's really an important thing when she's the one that's ill, to really take care of her first. It'll enhance your relationship a ton, absolutely a ton. And one of the things that goes on with all this, as the cortisol goes up, it raises the blood sugar. When you raise the blood sugar, the insulin rises to tell it to get into the tissues. That starts to make people fat. So with the thyroid being depressed and the sugars increasing, it makes people fat pretty darn quickly, and the fat distributes differently in adrenal cause, as the thyroid's typically lumpy, bumpy everywhere. Adrenal's typically in the thorax, so it gets thicker this way and wider that way, and the abdomen gets big, hangs, it sags over the waistline. It's just a classic adrenal look, where the legs are getting thinner because the large muscles are starting to atrophy. Whenever somebody that has the fat has about 27 different hormones, we'll look at aromatase here only for just a moment. Aromatase takes the circulating testosterone, then converts it into toxic estrogen, takes the estrogens in women, turns them into toxic estrogen and testosterone. So it really disrupts the sexuality of both men and women in a huge way, and that's stimulated with chronic stress. Cortisol and insulin are there with a increased blood sugar, which leads us to some other chronic health issues that go on with all that. So we look at a way that hormones get balanced. Diet is huge as far as that goes. How we eat determines how inflammatory we are. Real high vegetable diets with lots of grains and fish oils are really anti-inflammatory. Animal fats with lots of carbs and no vegetables are hyper-inflammatory. And toxins that come in through our food supply, our water supply, our air, our environment, those are really big. Those have to be found out and minimized a lot. The gut controls a lot of our hormones. It does it through the microbiota, makes a lot of that, and it's in the colon that determines whether we're going to excrete or recycle the byproducts of our hormones. The flora in the colon actually does that. There's nerves inside the gut that communicate with the brain, control the brain, and a lot of other things. And the gut is one of the primary routes of detoxification and elimination of toxins. The flora, it does the detoxification, digestion, makes hormones, ties in with brain function, makes all the neurotransmitters. It decides whether we're excreting or recycling toxins. Liver does detox, controls blood sugar, protein, makes bile. It's also got immune function. The brain has to do with hormone regulation. The thyroid determines energy. It's half of a woman's cycle. It has everything to do with pregnancy, and when it's dysfunctional, the likelihood of her carrying the term is reduced by about 60%. Adrenals, those control not only adrenal hormones, but sexual hormones. With that, they also control blood sugar, swelling, immune function, kidney function, posture, blood pressure. Somebody asked me earlier today that they have problems with anxiety and vertigo, and that's typically adrenal burnout. Both of those are pretty classic signs of that. And then you have the gonads. They capsulize the sexual hormones, which affect digestion, protein building, and every cell function that's out there. So if we look at something that's a culmination of a lot of hormonal dysfunction, people are told that PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, is a result of insulin resistance. Well, where the insulin resistance is created by a depressed adrenal, making way too much cortisol, raising up the blood sugars, and the insulin's trying to chase those back down. So with PCOS, you always have the adrenal issues. The thyroid's also depressed. And it's this combination of all of that going on. You can't just focus on one part. It's the same thing goes on with fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and a multitude of other things. You have this complex, interactive issue of hormones being dysregulated from toxicity. That's the root issue of all of it, and healthcare is just ignoring all that and throwing things at symptoms rather than dealing with the root cause. You can resolve all of those issues, but you've got to deal with the root causes, and that's typically what we do. The brain right here is one of the most nutrient-dependent, energy-dependent, toxic, vulnerable organs that we have. All of our hormonal organs are the same way, and this is really how a lot of the dysregulation happens, is right through this. If we look at, here's an article showing that the flora in the gut, it does make the neurotransmitters. And those are little chemicals that go across the switches inside the brain, the spinal cord, called the synapse, that keep that current, it's electrical current that makes the nerves work, going down the line and The gut flora makes a fair amount of those. The more research they do, the more it becomes apparent that they make every neurotransmitter and every hormone that we have. Acetaldehyde is the primary toxin that Candida puts out. It's 5 times more toxic than embalming fluid, formaldehyde. And it combines with dopamine to create a very toxic cocktail that kills the nerves that make dopamine. Dopamine's your feel-good hormone. So with Candida, this going on, it makes it so you cannot make dopamine. And it's part of the reason why people don't feel good. Then we add this one. Whenever the gut's leaking, it creates a scenario where people develop a lot more food intolerances, and there's a huge relationship between brain function and food intolerance, circulation, hormone issues, function. There's all kinds of different things. Those create different psychological disorders. That's really a common thing with autism, ADHD, ADD, things like that. Those people's guts are really a mess. They're really toxic. You deal with those and they're a whole different person. It's really a wonderful thing to work with them. We've had autistic kids that totally dysfunctional socially and interactive, and you fix their gut, you get them detoxified, and they're just vibrant. They really are. They're full of joy, and they're really happy, and they're interactive, and they're social, and the teachers at their schools just cannot believe it. So this is a real interesting study from the World Health Organization and some Nobel laureates also, that the value of dealing with your health nutritionally, it is a 20-to-1 return on your investment. And that's measured in increased production of life, lifestyle, quality of life, and all that. It's the best investment anybody could ever do, especially when you work with somebody that has such a high rate of getting people healthy again. It's really big. So we look at keys for healing. First one on the list that we always have people do is they got to get their elimination up to what normal is 3 to 5 times a day. That's regardless of what your personal experience is. Every society that doesn't have gastrointestinal disease, that's what their normal bowel habits are. We've worked with some 2 records. One was the once every 2 to 3 weeks. I couldn't believe that one. Heard about it. They came in. We started working with them. They got giddy when their bowel habits got up to 3 times a day. Their life just changed. The record that we had, though, was once every 5 to 6 weeks. Anybody should know that's not normal. When bowel habits are like that, people have air fresheners in the back of their toilet and all kinds of things to hide the smells and all that. When you have normal bowel habits, the stools really don't have much smell, and they shouldn't. Bladder elimination, women should go at least 8 times a day, men 5, and that's pretty much at all ages. You use vegetables to regulate the bowel function, starchy vegetables, stock vegetables. Leafy greens are more for nutrients and omega-3s. It's more of your cucurbits, I think is the right word for the vegetables you pluck off, is what really helps regulate those, and fruit to a smaller extent. We just shouldn't eat a lot of fruit. It'll dysregulate your blood sugar, and grain fiber is, we shouldn't have enough grain to regulate it. Some people are using coffee enemas. We've found that using green tea is a lot better. It's nowhere near as irritating. It's not as caustic. People can use that more than they can with the coffee. We've never seen anybody that can really handle coffee. Their physiology can handle coffee enemas for even 30 days. people do it for a lot longer than that, but it's crashing their physiology really hard. The green tea, especially a decaf, like a Salada decaf, is a really healthy way to do that. You always need to establish a foundation. Multivitamin is the best one there is in North America. Fish oil has to be there. That normalizes hormones and cell membranes, makes them fluid so you can get nutrient exchange, knocks down inflammation. That's the best one we found in North America there. Calcium, that's changing. They changed this formula without announcement, and we're scrambling to try and find a replacement of that. D3, it's a really good one. As your tan fades this time of year, you got to add that in, and until your tan returns in the spring, you keep it up. By the way, Mayo, when people are low on their vitamin D levels, they give them 50,000 IUs every other day. It takes 3 months to change the blood levels. So people need more than what they think. Commonly, a woman is like 10 to 12,000 IUs a day. A man's closer to 15,000 IUs a day through the winter to keep them up. And vitamin C is another real critical issue. Linus Pauling was trying to do his third Pulitzer Prize with his studies with it, and the industry didn't like what he did. It was pretty amazing, but they addressed everything, resolved everything with really simple things. It's amazing. You look at some of the studies. I think it was India, some of the prison systems, a doctor was in there, and people with all kinds of maladies, all they could prescribe was water, and he got a lot of people better just by increasing elimination. Vitamin C and vitamin D are really huge as far as that goes. Just normalizing those keep people from getting sick. So it's really big. 50% of a plate, every plate that you eat should be vegetables. You want to avoid corn. Corn is full of atrazine and glyphosate, which is Roundup. So anything that feeds off of corn, you want to get out of your diet. That includes all dairy, commercial meats, all your boxed and canned stuff. It's got corn in it. You really got to dig around to find where that stuff is. We test for that in all kinds of things, and they hide it all kinds of different ways. But corn is pretty toxic. Wheat, the biggest problem with wheat isn't the gluten, it's the Roundup that's in it. And that really makes that gluten in it hyperreactive. But people have been on wheat. You can't just switch to an organic till you fix the gut. And sugar, every pathogenic thing feeds off of sugar. So those are some foundational things you can do pretty much on your own. If you need to go any farther with things, here's an access to do that. I'll pull that down so you can see what the website is. That's access for doing a consultation with us to see what's going on with you. There's 3 forms on there I need to fill out in detail. The dietary diary is absolutely critical because it has everything to do with health. There's a timeline that goes back to grandparents, and everything you can put in there that you know of is really important. Old research was that a woman's health when she got pregnant affected 3 generations. Now they say it's at least 5. And to know what's gone on in your history is real important to what's going on with you now. So those really need to be filled out in detail. I can't do too much detail. We need 3 pictures, one from the front, whole self, one from the side, whole self, and one of the face. Those give us a lot of insight into health conditions with somebody. Email those to us, and once we get all that together, we can schedule a time to do a consultation. And most people in our consultations, they learn more in a consultation because I go over what's going on with them. They learn more in one of our consultations than working with other docs for decades. Multiple docs, all combined. They learn more in our consultations because we're going over what's causing what. So anybody really wants to go forward and really want to deal with their health, this is the access to do it. And we do way more care. As I said, our evaluations are over $9,000 worth of lab tests, and we do those monthly. So in the course of 6 months, if you went somewhere else, that'd be over $60,000 just in lab tests. That's not care. And we can usually get people from my cost, we can usually get them well for less than what the labs would be. So, and we're doing care more often. We get into doing mold inspections. We do environmental toxin inspections. We do that from a distance, and it's amazing how accurate that is, how many people we do that with, and say, yep, mold's right there, and they look and go, yeah, I see it. So it's really, really big. Anybody that's got chronic health issues, they need so many things addressed that just commonly aren't done. And mold companies are not very accurate in their testing, nor are they very good and detailed in their cleansing. We did a mold inspection with somebody that has a big new house, 7 bathrooms, young kids, and every place that I stopped the owner and said, yeah, okay, where are you at? And you got mold right there. Every place was a place where the kids had overflowed a bathtub somewhere before. The house was only 7 years old. Mold on the outside, mold on the inside. Had a mold company come in to try and deal with it, and he said, hey, you did do a thorough job. You can still see it in there. And the guy says, you're picky. You're just picky. Well, you should be. You really should be. But, it was, I told him a different way to do it and get somebody else, a handyman, and be actually better to deal with that. But that's what a lot of people's experience is. They think they need to know what kind of mold it is. No, you need to know where it is and how to get rid of it. That's what's really important. And there's ways to do that pretty cost effectively. So, we're doing all that, getting with people, helping them walk through their lifestyle changes and everything else. And the level of care we do is just beyond what anybody else does. So I invite you, if you're really looking to try and resolve some of your health issues, this is a pathway to do it. Get a hold of us through the consultation, fill out the forms, send the pictures to us. When we get all those filled out, we'll schedule a time and we'll figure out what's going on with you and how to go forward. So thanks for your time. We'll see you on the consultation side. Thanks.